Take a deep breath. You're safe here. Tonight, you'll drift into sleep on a forgotten island in the vast Pacific, where waves whisper ancient lullabies and the world moves at the gentle pace of tides and seasons. Welcome to Nights of Tranquility and Stories. I'm so glad you're here. Whether you've come seeking rest after a long day, relief from a restless mind, or simply a peaceful escape, you've found the right place. Tonight's story takes us to the 18th century, to a remote island where a Scottish sailor named Alexander Selkirk lived alone for 4 years, the real-life inspiration for Robinson Crusoe. But we won't focus on struggle or hardship. Instead, we'll explore the profound peace he discovered, the simple beauty of island life, and the meditative rhythm of days lived in harmony with the sea and sky. So settle into your favorite spot, let your shoulders relax, and allow your breathing to slow and deepen. Close your eyes if you wish, or simply soften your gaze. Let the sounds of the ocean carry you away. This is your time to rest, to wander through tranquil landscapes, and to find the stillness that waits beneath the noise of everyday life. Let's begin this peaceful journey together. Part 1. The Island of Solitude. The island rises from the Pacific like a dream half remembered, a place so remote that most maps never bothered to mark its existence. Maze Tierra, they would later call it, closer to land, though in truth it sits nearly 400 miles from the coast of Chile, surrounded by nothing but endless blue horizons. It's a volcanic island, born from fire beneath the sea, now dressed in green forests and crowned with mist. Steep cliffs plunge into foaming surf, while hidden valleys cradle streams that sing their way to the ocean. Seabirds wheel overhead in lazy circles, their cries echoing off stone faces worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. This is where Alexander Selkirk found himself in the autumn of 1704, standing on a narrow beach as his ship's boat pulled away through the breakers. He was 28 years old, a sailing master from the small Scottish port of Largo, and he had just made a decision that would define the rest of his life. The ship he'd been serving on, the Cinque Ports, was in poor condition, leaking, worm-eaten, barely seaworthy. In a moment of frustration and principle, he demanded to be set ashore rather than continue the voyage. The captain had called his bluff, and now Selkirk stood alone, watching the only connection to his former world disappear into the vastness of the ocean. But let's not dwell on that moment of separation. Instead, imagine how the island must have felt in those first quiet hours after the ship vanished below the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The waves continued their eternal rhythm, rolling up the sand with a sound like breathing, in and out, a meditation that would become the backdrop to every day of the next 4 years. Somewhere in the forest behind him, birds were settling into their evening roosts, their final songs fading into the gentle rustle of palm fronds and the whisper of wind through unfamiliar trees. Selkirk had been left with a few essential items: a musket, some gunpowder, a hatchet, a knife, a kettle, a Bible, and his navigational instruments. He had the clothes on his back and the skills of a capable seaman. What he didn't yet know was that this island, for all its apparent isolation, was a kind of paradise, a place where fresh water ran clear from mountain springs, where wild goats descended from animals left by Spanish sailors grazed in meadows, where fish crowded the coastal shallows, and where the climate was mild enough that a man could sleep under the stars without fear of freezing. Those first days passed in a blur of practical necessities. He needed shelter, so he found a natural cave set back from the beach, protected from the wind and rain by an overhang of rock. He needed food, so he learned to catch fish with his bare hands in the tide pools, discovered which plants were edible, and managed to bring down his first goat with the musket. He needed fire, so he carefully rationed his gunpowder, using it to create sparks that he nurtured into flames, feeding them with dry wood gathered from the forest floor. But more than any of these physical needs, Selkirk discovered he needed rhythm. The human mind, left without structure, can become unmoored, so he created patterns for his days. He woke with the sun, not because he had to, but because it gave shape to time. He walked the same paths each morning, checking the beaches for anything the tide might have brought in: driftwood, shells, sometimes pieces of ships that had foundered on distant reefs. He maintained his shelter with the care of a housekeeper, sweeping sand from the cave floor, arranging his few possessions in an orderly fashion, keeping his knife sharp and his musket clean. He learned the island's geography with the intimacy of a lover. There was the eastern beach where he'd been marooned, a crescent of golden sand backed by palms and flowering bushes he couldn't name. There was the northern headland where he could climb to watch for ships on the horizon, though none ever came, at least not in those first long months. There was the valley with its freshwater stream, where ferns grew thick as carpet, and the air was always cool and damp. And there was the summit of the island's tallest peak, a climb that took half a day, but rewarded him with views of the entire world he now inhabited. Rock and forest and sea stretching away in every direction. The goats became his companions in a way. They were the descendants of animals left behind by Spanish expeditions decades earlier, and they'd multiplied across the island, developing their own trails and territories. At first, Selkirk hunted them only when he needed meat, but gradually he began to enjoy the chase itself, not for the kill, but for the running. He would pursue them up mountainsides and through forests, his body growing lean and powerful from the constant movement. Sometimes he would simply sit and watch them graze, noting their social structures, the way the older females led the herds, the mock battles between young males testing their strength. His clothing wore out within months. The tropical sun, salt spray, and constant movement through thorny brush reduced his sailor's garments to tatters. So he learned to work with goatskin, curing the hides by methods he half remembered from stories told by old seamen, stitching together rough but functional garments, using needles made from fish bones and thread teased from plant fibers. He made himself a jacket, trousers, a cap to shade his eyes from the fierce midday sun. He fashioned sandals that protected his feet on rocky ground, though often he simply went barefoot, his soles growing thick and calloused. As the weeks turned into months, something unexpected began to happen. The initial panic and loneliness, the desperate scanning of horizons for sails that never appeared, began to fade. In its place came something quieter, something almost like contentment. Selkirk found himself falling into the rhythms of the island as naturally as breathing. He woke when light touched the eastern sky, painting the ocean in shades of pearl and gold. He slept when darkness fell, lulled by the eternal song of waves and the chirping of night insects. He talked to himself, of course. It was the only way to keep his mind sharp, to remember that he was human and not just another creature of the island. He would recite passages from the Bible, working through entire chapters from memory. He sang songs he'd learned in Scottish taverns, his voice echoing off the cliff walls. He conducted conversations with imaginary companions, debating navigation techniques, discussing philosophy, telling jokes to an audience of seabirds who cocked their heads as if listening. But increasingly, he also valued silence. There were days when he spoke no words at all, when he simply existed in the flow of the island's life. He would sit on his favorite promontory and watch clouds build over the ocean, great towers of white and gray that spoke of distant storms. He would lie in the shade of a palm grove and listen to the complex symphony of nature, the rustle of leaves, the buzz of insects, the distant crash of surf, the closer patter of streams over stones, the calls of countless birds whose names he would never know. The seasons here were subtle, not the dramatic swing between summer and winter he'd known in Scotland. But there were rhythms nonetheless. Months when the rains came more frequently, turning the streams into rushing torrents and painting every leaf in vivid green. Months when the sun blazed day after day, when the wind came from the north and brought a different quality to the light. Months when certain fruits ripened in the forest, when fish schooled in dense masses just offshore, when particular flowers bloomed and filled the air with perfume. Selkirk marked time by carving notches into a piece of driftwood, one for each day. But gradually, these marks became less important. What did it matter if it was the 100th day or the 110th? The island existed outside human calendars. Time here was measured in tides and moons, in the slow turning of seasons, in the endless patience of mountains being worn down grain by wind and water. He created routines that were almost ceremonial in their regularity. Each morning, he would climb to his lookout point and scan the horizon, not because he truly expected to see a ship, though hope never entirely died, but because it was a ritual that connected him to the larger world. Each evening, as the sun sank toward the western ocean, he would light his fire and prepare his simple meal. Sometimes it was goat meat roasted on sticks, sometimes fish wrapped in leaves and cooked in the coals, sometimes just fruits and roots he'd gathered during the day. He learned patience. Real patience, not the forced tolerance of discomfort that passes for patience in civilized society. When he wanted fish and the fish weren't biting, he simply sat and watched the water until they were ready to be caught. When he needed to make a tool and lacked the right materials, he waited until the tide brought him what he required, or until his wanderings revealed the perfect piece of wood or stone. There was no hurry. There was nowhere to be except exactly where he was. The night sky became a cathedral to him. Without any light pollution, without even the glow of a distant city, the stars revealed themselves in all their glory. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, so dense with stars that he could hardly distinguish individual points. He relearned the constellations he'd used for navigation, seeing them now not as tools, but as companions. There was the Southern Cross, guiding any sailor who knew how to read it. There were patterns he remembered from childhood, rising and setting with the seasons, just as they did everywhere on Earth. Sometimes the island would remind him that it was not entirely tame, not entirely safe. There were earth tremors occasionally, subtle reminders that this land had been born from volcanic fury and might one day return to fire. Storms would sweep in from the Pacific with awesome power, turning the usually gentle ocean into a maelstrom of white water and howling wind. During these tempests, Selkirk would retreat to his cave and listen to nature's fury, humbled by forces so vastly greater than himself. But the storms always passed, and the island always endured, and he learned to endure with it. He kept his mind active through observation and learning. He studied the behavior of the animals around him with the attention of a natural philosopher. He noticed that certain birds appeared only at certain times of year, migrants passing through on journeys between distant continents. He observed the hunting strategies of the island's hawks, the social behaviors of the seal colonies on the western rocks, the territorial displays of male goats during mating season. He tracked the phases of the moon and learned to predict the strength of tides. He studied weather patterns, learning to read the clouds and the wind to anticipate storms hours before they arrived. His body transformed. The soft flesh of a sailor who'd spent months at sea, eating ship's rations, melted away, replaced by lean muscle and leathery skin. He could run for hours without tiring, climb cliffs that would have terrified his younger self, swim in rough waters without fear. His senses sharpened too. He could hear the faint splash of a fish jumping at a distance that would have been silence to his old ears. He could smell rain coming long before clouds appeared. His eyes grew keen enough to spot a ship on the horizon at distances his former crewmates would have thought impossible, though no ships came. But perhaps the most profound change was internal. The constant chatter of his mind, the worries, the regrets, the plans and schemes that had filled his thoughts in his previous life, gradually quieted. Not through discipline or effort, but simply through the gentle erosion of time and solitude. There was nothing to worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow would be essentially the same as today. There was nothing to regret, because there was no one to judge him. There was nothing to plan, because the island provided everything he needed. He began to understand something that mystics and hermits had known throughout history, that solitude, true solitude, could be not just bearable, but transformative. In the absence of other human voices, he began to hear his own voice more clearly. In the absence of society's expectations and judgments, he began to understand who he actually was beneath all the roles and masks. He was not Alexander Selkirk, sailing master. Not Alexander Selkirk, son of a Scottish tanner. Not Alexander Selkirk, a man who'd argued with his captain. He was simply a consciousness experiencing life on an island in the Pacific, no more and no less significant than the goats that grazed the hillsides or the palms that swayed in the breeze. This realization brought a strange kind of peace. He was part of something larger, the island's ecosystem, the ocean's rhythms, the slow dance of planets and stars. His personal drama, which had once seemed so important, revealed itself as a tiny ripple in a vast sea. And somehow, that made everything easier. There was no need to strive or achieve or prove anything. There was only need to exist, to observe, to participate in the ongoing miracle of life. The first year passed, then the second. Selkirk stopped counting days with quite the same urgency. His notches on the driftwood continued, a habit more than a necessity. He had long since mastered the practical skills of survival. He knew where to find the best fishing, when the fruit trees would bear, how to predict the weather with uncanny accuracy. His clothing, crude but functional, kept him comfortable in all seasons. His shelter had been improved and expanded, becoming almost cozy with its bed of dried grasses, its carefully arranged stones for cooking, its neat organization. But what filled his days now was not just survival. It was something closer to living. He spent hours simply being present, sitting by the stream and watching light filter through leaves, lying on warm rocks and feeling the sun on his skin, swimming in clear lagoons and marveling at the colors of tropical fish. He explored every corner of his island with the dedication of a cartographer, discovering hidden valleys and secret beaches, grottos where waves had carved sculptures from stone, meadows where flowers bloomed in seasons known only to them. He developed favorite spots, places he would return to again and again because they offered something special. There was a sheltered cove on the southern shore where the water was always calm, where he could float on his back and watch clouds drift overhead. There was a ridge halfway up the mountain where the wind came clean and cool, where he could see both the sunrise and the sunset from the same vantage point. There was a grove of trees whose branches formed a natural shelter where he sometimes slept just to hear the different quality of night sounds filtered through leaves. And always, always, there was the ocean. It surrounded him completely, an endless expanse of blue that changed color with the time of day and the angle of the sun. Sometimes it was turquoise and transparent, revealing sandy bottom and schools of silver fish. Sometimes it was deep navy, mysterious and impenetrable. Sometimes during storms, it was gray-green and angry, hurling itself against the rocks with primal force. But mostly it was simply there, present, eternal, a companion that never left him, a lullaby that never ended, a meditation on the nature of time and change and the endless cycles that govern all existence. Part 2. The Wisdom of Wilderness. By the time the third year began, Alexander Selkirk had become something more than a castaway waiting for rescue. He had become a creature of the island itself, as much a part of its ecosystem as the goats that grazed its slopes or the palms that bent in its breezes. His transformation was complete, not just physically but spiritually. He moved through the landscape with an ease that spoke of deep familiarity, reading the subtle signs that told him where to find food, when weather would change, how the tides would run. The mornings had their own sacred quality. He would wake just before dawn, that liminal time when the world holds its breath between darkness and light. The stars would still be visible overhead, though fading as the eastern sky began to pale. He would lie for a moment in his shelter, listening to the awakening of the island, the first tentative bird songs, the rustle of small creatures beginning their daily routines, the eternal whisper of waves that never truly slept. Then he would rise and walk down to the beach to greet the sun. This dawn ritual had become his meditation, his prayer without words. He would stand at the water's edge, letting the cool sand squeeze between his toes, feeling the first gentle waves lap around his ankles. And he would watch as light returned to the world. First came a glow on the horizon, a hint of gold beneath layers of deep blue and purple. Then the colors would begin to build, rose and amber, coral and crimson, painting the underbelly of clouds in shades that seemed almost unnatural in their intensity. Finally, the sun itself would break free of the ocean's embrace, a sphere of molten light that transformed the sea into a sheet of hammered gold. In those moments, Selkirk felt something that words could barely capture. It was not happiness exactly, nor contentment in any simple sense. It was more like a profound rightness, a sense of being exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The worries that had once plagued him about his reputation, his future, his place in society, seemed like memories from another life, or perhaps from a dream that had never been quite real. His relationship with the island's animals had deepened over the years. The goats no longer fled at his approach. They had learned that he was not always a threat, that sometimes he simply wanted to observe them or walk among them. There was one old female in particular who seemed almost curious about him. She would approach to within a few paces, her amber eyes studying him with what looked like intelligence, before returning to her grazing. He'd named her Grace, though he knew she had no concept of names, and that the naming was more for his benefit than hers. He'd also developed an unexpected friendship with the island seals. There was a colony that hauled out on the western rocks, and at first they'd been wary of him, barking warnings and sliding quickly into the water whenever he appeared. But with patience, that endless patience that solitude had taught him, he'd won their tolerance and eventually something like acceptance. He would sit on the rocks among them, not too close but near enough to observe their social interactions, to watch the pups play fighting in shallow pools, to see the massive bulls defending their territories with displays of strength rather than actual violence. The seals seemed to recognize him as a regular feature of their world, neither threat nor prey, but simply another being who shared their spaces. Sometimes, when he swam in the deeper waters, young seals would approach and circle him with graceful underwater ballet, their movements so fluid and perfect that he felt clumsy by comparison. They would dive and surface, their dark eyes seeming to invite him to play. And he would try, diving down as deep as his lungs would allow, though he knew he could never match their aquatic mastery. Birds, too, had become his companions. There were the frigate birds that soared on thermals high above the island, their long wings and forked tails making them masters of the air. There were pelicans that would crash dive into schools of fish, emerging with their pouches full and water streaming from their feathers. There were tiny hummingbirds that visited the island's flowers, their wings beating so fast they seemed to exist in a different dimension of time. And there were the petrels and shearwaters that would return to the island at dusk, filling the air with their strange, haunting calls. He learned to identify each species not just by sight, but by sound and behavior. He knew which birds nested where, which were year-round residents and which were visitors, which were bold enough to steal fish from his catch and which kept their distance. He learned that certain birds were indicators of weather changes. When the frigate birds flew unusually high, a storm was often coming. When the petrels stayed away from their usual roosting sites, the night would be particularly wild. The island's plant life had revealed its secrets to him gradually. He'd learned through careful experimentation which fruits and roots were safe to eat. Some discoveries came easy. The sweet pulp of fruits that birds also ate, the tender shoots of plants that goats grazed on. Others required more courage and caution, testing small amounts and waiting to see if they caused illness. He'd found plants whose leaves could soothe insect bites, others that made excellent cordage, still others that could be used to poison fish in tide pools, making them easier to catch. There were trees whose wood burned hot and clean, perfect for cooking. Trees whose bark could be peeled in long strips and woven into rough cloth. Trees that provided shade so dense that rain hardly penetrated their canopy. He'd learned the cycles of flowering and fruiting, knowing months in advance when certain foods would become available. This knowledge freed him from the anxiety of scarcity. The island would always provide, if he remained patient and observant. His days had developed a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. He would wake with the dawn, spend the early morning hours fishing or gathering food for the day. The middle hours, when the sun was most intense, he would spend in shade, sometimes sleeping, sometimes simply sitting and letting his mind wander, sometimes working on practical projects like maintaining his shelter or crafting new tools. Late afternoon was for exploration or exercise, running along the beaches or climbing the island slopes, keeping his body strong and capable. Evening was for his fire, his simple meal, and the long descent into darkness with all its peaceful sounds and infinite stars. But increasingly, he found himself drawn to simply being still. He would sit for hours without moving, watching the play of light on water, the movement of clouds across the sky, the subtle shifts in color as day progressed toward night. This wasn't boredom or idleness. It was more like the meditation of monks he'd heard about, a deliberate practice of presence and awareness. In these moments of stillness, he felt most alive, most connected to the world around him. He began to notice things he'd never seen before, despite years on the island. the way certain insects visited certain flowers at certain times of day, the patterns of foam that waves created as they retreated down the beach, the specific angle of light needed to make a rainbow appear in the spray from waterfalls, the way wind moving through different types of leaves created different musical notes. The island was endlessly complex, endlessly fascinating, if only he paid attention. Time itself began to feel different. Days didn't drag as they had in those first desperate months. They flowed, each one unique, yet part of a larger pattern. He stopped thinking in terms of how long until rescue and started experiencing each day as complete in itself. Today he would fish and gather fruit and watch the sunset. Tomorrow would be essentially the same, yet somehow entirely different, because the ocean would be a different shade of blue. The wind would come from a different direction. A bird he'd never seen before might appear on the island's shores. This acceptance of the present moment brought profound peace. He realized that much of his suffering in his previous life had come from always being somewhere else in his mind, regretting the past or anxiously anticipating the future. But here, now, there was only this breath, this moment, this sensation of sand beneath his feet and sun on his face and the endless symphony of waves. Past and future became abstract concepts. The present was all that truly existed, and it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. His spiritual life deepened in ways that surprised him. He'd never been particularly religious in his younger years, despite the Presbyterian faith of his Scottish upbringing. He'd gone to church because everyone did, read the Bible because it was expected, but the words had never truly penetrated his heart. Now, alone with nothing but nature and silence, he found himself returning to those half-remembered verses with new understanding. He would recite the Psalms while walking the beaches, and suddenly their poetry made perfect sense. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Yes, he could see that now in the endless variations of sunset, in the precise mechanics of tides and seasons. Be still and know that I am God. He understood that stillness now, had learned it in his bones. The Bible spoke often of wilderness as a place of transformation, where prophets went to hear divine voices. He was no prophet, but he understood the wilderness now as a teacher, stripping away everything false until only truth remained. But his spirituality was not confined to Christian texts. He found the sacred in everything, in the perfect spiral of a seashell, in the fierce concentration of a hunting bird, in the patient endurance of stones being slowly worn smooth by water. If there was a divine presence in the world, it was not distant and abstract, but immediate and present in every leaf and wave and breath. He felt it most strongly at dawn and dusk, those transitional times when one state gave way to another, when the boundaries between earth and sky, land and sea, self and world seemed to soften and blur. He talked to the island sometimes, not as if it were a person, but as if it were a conscious presence that could somehow hear and understand. He would thank it for the fish he caught, for the fruit that sustained him, for the beauty that fed his soul. This might have seemed like madness to an outside observer, but it felt perfectly natural to him. The island had become his home, his companion, perhaps even his teacher. Speaking to it was no stranger than a sailor speaking to his ship, or a farmer to his land. The solitude that had once threatened to break his mind had instead clarified it. He could think with a purity and focus that had been impossible in the noise and chaos of human society. When he contemplated a question, philosophical, practical, or spiritual, he could hold it in his attention for hours or even days without distraction. His thoughts had room to develop fully, to reach their natural conclusions without being interrupted or derailed. He thought deeply about the nature of happiness and realized that most of what he'd been taught was wrong. Happiness was not something to be pursued or achieved through accumulation of possessions, status, or experiences. It was simply a natural state that emerged when one stopped resisting the present moment. Here on the island, he owned almost nothing, had no status, and his experiences were largely repetitive. Yet he felt a deep contentment that he'd never known in his previous life of ambition and striving. He thought about freedom and realized that he was freer now, supposedly imprisoned on this island, than he'd ever been in civilized society. No one told him what to do or who to be. No one judged his choices or measured him against standards he'd never agreed to. He answered to no master but nature itself, and nature's demands were simple and fair. Adapt or perish, but within those bounds, do as you will. He thought about purpose and meaning, and found that these two were simpler than philosophy made them seem. His purpose was to live, to experience, to participate in the grand dance of existence. The meaning of his life was not something he needed to create or discover. It was inherent in the simple fact of being alive and aware. Every breath was meaningful. Every sunrise was meaningful. Every moment of presence was its own justification. The seasons continued their subtle dance. There were months when the winds came from the northeast, bringing warmer temperatures and fewer clouds. Months when southern winds prevailed, carrying cooler air and frequent mists that would drape the island's peaks like veils. Months when the rains came in earnest, turning the island into a paradise of green, when every stream became a rushing torrent and waterfalls appeared on cliff faces that were dry the rest of the year. And months of relative drought, when the vegetation took on bronze tones and the streams dwindled to trickles, though they never entirely dried up. He learned to love each season for what it offered. The rains brought lush growth and an abundance of fresh water collected in natural basins. The dry months made exploring easier and brought schools of certain fish closer to shore. The warm months were perfect for swimming and lounging in the sun. The cool months were ideal for vigorous hiking and running without overheating. The island provided everything he needed, when he needed it, as if its cycles had been designed specifically for human comfort. His body continued to adapt and strengthen. He could run up slopes that would have left him gasping in his earlier life, his legs burning with effort. Now he climbed with the easy rhythm of the goats, barely breathing hard even on the steepest inclines. He could hold his breath for what seemed like impossible lengths of time, diving deep to explore underwater caves and coral formations. His hands had grown calloused and capable, able to work with materials that would have blistered softer skin. His feet could navigate sharp rocks and rough terrain without complaint. But it wasn't just physical strength. His senses had sharpened to a degree that seemed almost superhuman. He could hear the splash of a fish breaking the surface from hundreds of yards away. He could smell rain coming hours before clouds appeared on the horizon. His eyes could detect movement at distances that blurred for most people. A bird launching from a distant cliff, a goat moving through undergrowth on a far hillside. This wasn't supernatural. It was simply what happened when a human being lived in close contact with nature, relying on observation for survival without the numbing distractions of civilization. At night, his dreams became vivid and strange. Sometimes he dreamed of his life before the island, of Scottish taverns and busy ports, of the cramped quarters of sailing ships, of family members he'd left behind and might never see again. These dreams could be bittersweet, filled with nostalgia for a world he'd lost. But increasingly, he dreamed of the island itself. He would dream of swimming with the seals in waters impossibly clear and warm. He would dream of flying with the frigate birds, seeing the island from above as a jewel set in endless blue. He would dream of speaking with the goats, who would tell him ancient secrets in a language he could somehow understand. When he woke from these dreams, he felt no disappointment at returning to reality. The boundary between dreaming and waking had become thin and permeable. His waking life on the island had a dreamlike quality, peaceful, timeless, suffused with wonder, and his dreams had the vividness and presence of waking life. He existed in both states with equal presence and awareness, no longer sure which was more real, or if the distinction even mattered. He marked the passing of his 3rd year on the island with a kind of ceremony. He climbed to the highest point he could safely reach and spent the entire day there, from before sunrise to long after sunset. He watched the light change across the ocean, saw squalls moving in the distance, observed the patterns of bird flight and cloud formation. He thought about the man who had arrived on this island 3 years ago, angry, prideful, certain that he'd made a terrible mistake. And he thought about the man he'd become, peaceful, humble, certain of almost nothing except the beauty of the present moment. That old Selkirk seemed like a stranger now, someone he'd known long ago, but no longer truly understood. The concerns that had driven that younger man, reputation, advancement, the respect of his peers, seemed not just distant but incomprehensible. What did any of that matter compared to the feeling of sun on skin, the taste of fresh water, the sight of stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns? He had lost everything that society said was important, and in losing it, he had gained something infinitely more valuable, a direct, unmediated experience of life itself. As the sun set on that anniversary day, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood, Selkirk felt something unexpected. Gratitude, not despite his circumstances, but because of them. This island, which had seemed like a prison, had become his liberation. This solitude, which had threatened to destroy him, had instead revealed his true self. This wilderness, which should have been his death, had given him a kind of life he'd never imagined possible. He spoke aloud to the darkening sky, his voice rough from disuse, but clear and certain. Thank you. For what, exactly? He couldn't have said. For everything. For nothing. For this moment, and all the moments that had led to it, and all the moments yet to come. For the privilege of being alive and aware in a world so beautiful, it sometimes hurt to see it. For the lesson that happiness was not something to be chased, but something that emerged naturally when you stopped running. The stars began to appear, first one by one, then in increasing numbers, until the entire dome of heaven was alive with light. He lay back on the warm stone and let his eyes wander across that celestial landscape, seeing patterns and stories written in the positions of distant suns. Somewhere out there, beyond those stars, beyond the black gulf of space, perhaps there were other islands, other solitary souls learning the same lessons he'd learned. The thought brought him comfort. He was alone but not isolated. He was part of something vast and interconnected, a single note in a cosmic symphony. As sleep began to claim him there on the mountain, with the whole of his island kingdom spread below him and the infinity of space above, Alexander Selkirk smiled. Tomorrow he would wake and fish and gather food and sit in stillness watching the play of light on water. And it would be perfect, exactly as it was. He had everything he needed. He was home. Part 3. The Return to Stillness. The 4th year on the island brought a depth of understanding that transcended everything Selkirk had learned before. He had moved beyond survival, beyond adaptation, beyond even contentment. He had entered a state that mystics throughout history had sought, but few had found: a profound unity with the world around him, a dissolution of the boundaries between self and other, observer and observed. He was no longer a man living on an island. He was part of the island itself, as essential and natural as the trees that grew from its soil or the waves that shaped its shores. His mornings had become a form of moving meditation. He would wake without effort, his body knowing instinctively when darkness was about to yield to light. He would walk to the beach through pre-dawn shadows, his feet finding the path without conscious thought. And he would stand at the threshold between land and sea, between night and day, feeling himself as a point of awareness through which the universe observed itself. The sun would rise, as it had risen countless times before, and would rise countless times after he was gone, and he would witness this miracle with fresh eyes, as if seeing it for the first time. The quality of his attention had changed. Where once he had looked at the world, now he seemed to look from within it. When he watched a bird in flight, there was a moment when the separation between watcher and bird dissolved, and he felt the wind beneath those wings as if they were his own. When he swam in the ocean, he became water moving through water, no longer a foreign body, but a temporary form taken by the sea itself. This wasn't imagination or metaphor. It was direct experience, as real as anything he'd ever known. His relationship with time had transformed completely. The anxiety of waiting for rescue, which had colored his first months and even years on the island, had evaporated like mist in morning sun. He no longer thought in terms of when or how long. Each day was eternal in itself, containing everything that mattered. The past was a story he remembered, but no longer identified with. The future was an abstraction that had no power over his present peace. There was only now, this endless now that somehow contained all of time within its stillness. He had stopped marking days on his driftwood calendar. The notches were still there, a record of time past, but he no longer felt compelled to add to them. What did numbers matter? The island operated on different schedules. The schedule of tides that changed daily, the schedule of seasons that changed monthly, the schedule of geological time measured in centuries and millennia. His own brief human lifespan was just a flicker in that vast temporal landscape, no more or less significant than the life of a butterfly or a boulder. This acceptance of impermanence brought unexpected freedom. He had worried in his earlier life about legacy and memory. He had wanted to matter, to be remembered, to leave some mark on the world that would outlast his mortal body. Now he understood the vanity of such concerns. The waves erased every mark he made in the sand. The wind scattered every pile of stones he arranged. The forest would reclaim his shelter within years of his departure. Nothing he did would last, and that was perfectly fine. The purpose of life was not to create permanence, but to participate fully in the temporary dance of existence. The island showed him death without horror. He found the remains of goats that had lived their lives and come to their natural end. He saw birds that had fallen from the sky, their journeys complete. He watched fish caught in tide pools slowly suffocate as the water evaporated in the sun. Death was not an enemy to be feared, but a natural transition, no more dramatic than day giving way to night. Everything that lived also died, and in dying, provided sustenance for new life. The goat's body fed scavengers and insects, which fed birds, which fed the island's ecosystem. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was truly lost. Forms changed, but the underlying energy persisted, transforming endlessly. This understanding eased fears he hadn't even known he carried. He was not afraid of dying on this island. If that was his fate, it would be a good death, peacefully becoming part of the place that had given him so much. His body would feed the soil that fed the plants that fed the goats. His bones would be worn smooth by weather and time, indistinguishable from the stone and coral that formed the island's skeleton. There was comfort in this thought, a rightness that made the prospect of death not something to dread, but simply another aspect of the natural order. But life continued, day after day, each one a gift he received with gratitude. He had refined his daily practices until they were nearly effortless. Fishing had become so intuitive that he rarely returned empty-handed. He knew which pools held which species at which times of day. He understood the relationship between tide, moon phase, and fish behavior. He could read the water's surface like a book, seeing the subtle signs that revealed what swam beneath. Gathering food had become equally natural. He knew the location of every fruit tree, every edible plant, every reliable source of fresh water. He knew the seasons of ripening and flowering, could predict weeks in advance when certain foods would become available. He harvested with respect and moderation, never taking more than he needed, always leaving enough for the plants to regenerate and for the animals that also depended on these resources. He was not dominating nature, but participating in it, one creature among many, taking his place in the island's web of life. His shelter had evolved into something almost beautiful. What had started as a crude cave had been transformed through patient labor into a comfortable home. He'd built walls from fitted stones, chinked with clay from the stream beds. He'd woven mats from palm fronds to cover the floor and soften his sleeping area. He'd created niches in the walls where he stored his few possessions, his Bible, his navigational instruments, tools he'd crafted from found materials. A small shelf held interesting objects he'd collected not for utility, but for beauty. Unusual shells, pieces of driftwood worn into sculptural forms, stones with interesting colors or patterns, feathers from rare birds. He'd even created art in his own rough way. Using charcoal from his fires, he'd drawn on smooth stone surfaces images of the animals he lived among, maps of the island as he'd learned it, patterns that emerged from his contemplative states. These drawings were primitive, the work of untrained hands, but they satisfied something deep within him. They were offerings to the beauty that surrounded him, attempts to capture and honor what he witnessed daily. Music had become part of his life too. He'd fashioned a crude flute from bamboo-like reeds that grew in the damp valleys. Its notes were simple but pure, and he would play in the evenings, improvising melodies that echoed the sounds of the island, the rhythm of waves, the calls of birds, the whisper of wind through leaves. Sometimes he sang, his voice blending with the flute, creating harmonies that satisfied no audience but himself and perhaps the stars overhead. This music wasn't performance. It was expression, the overflow of contentment seeking form. His body had become a finely tuned instrument. Every movement was efficient, economical, precise. He could climb, run, swim, dive, and navigate rough terrain with an ease that would have seemed superhuman to his civilized self. His muscles were lean and hard, his skin weathered but healthy, his senses sharp as any wild creature's. He was probably in the best physical condition of his life, despite living on a diet that would have horrified any physician. Mostly fish, fruit, roots, and occasional goat meat, with no bread, no beer, none of the staples of Scottish cuisine. But more important than physical health was the profound sense of well-being that suffused his entire being. He woke each day without the weight of anxiety or depression. He moved through his hours without the restlessness that had plagued his younger years. He slept deeply and dreamlessly, or when dreams came, they were vivid and meaningful, gifts from some deeper layer of consciousness. He rarely felt bored, never felt lonely in any painful way, and possessed a baseline of contentment that no circumstance seemed able to disturb. He had discovered what philosophers and sages had been trying to teach for millennia, that happiness was not dependent on external circumstances. He had almost nothing by society's standards, yet lacked for nothing essential. He had no entertainment, yet was never bored. He had no human companionship, yet felt deeply connected to life. The secret was simple, though difficult to practice in the noise of civilization. Be present, accept what is, want what you have, and recognize that most human suffering comes from resistance to reality rather than from reality itself. The island continued to reveal its secrets. He discovered hot springs on the eastern slope, places where heated water bubbled up from deep beneath the earth, creating pools that were perfect for soaking weary muscles. He found caves he'd somehow missed in previous explorations, their walls covered in crystalline formations that glittered in the light of his torch. He located a valley where a particular type of orchid grew in such profusion that the air was thick with perfume during blooming season. The island was larger than it appeared, more complex, endlessly fascinating to one who paid attention. He witnessed events that few humans ever see. He watched a total lunar eclipse paint the moon blood red, with the stars shining so brightly in the darkened sky that he could see his own shadow. He saw ball lightning during a storm, glowing spheres that drifted across the beach like conscious beings before dissipating into nothing. He observed the birth of a seal pup, watching the mother nurture her offspring with a tenderness that seemed almost human. He saw a meteorite streak across the sky and crash into the ocean with a distant splash, a visitor from the depths of space meeting its end in earthly waters. The animals had fully accepted him now. The goats would graze peacefully, even when he walked among them. The seals would barely acknowledge his presence on their rocks. Birds would land near his shelter, sometimes even inside it, searching for scraps or simply resting. He had become part of the island's fauna, another creature going about its business, neither threat nor novelty. This acceptance felt like belonging, like finally finding his place in the natural order. He had long conversations with himself, but the character of these conversations had changed. In the beginning, they had been anxious dialogues, one part of him arguing with another about decisions and possibilities. Now they were more like meditation, one part of him asking questions and another part answering from a place of deep intuition. He would ask, "What is the meaning of life?" And the answer would come, not in words, but in the feeling of sun on skin, the taste of fresh water, the sight of waves rolling eternally toward the shore. The meaning was in the living itself, not in any abstraction about it. He thought about the people he'd left behind, his family in Scotland, his crewmates on various ships, friends from his youth. He hoped they were well, but he felt no urgent need to return to them. If rescue came, he would accept it. If it didn't, that was fine too. He had stopped seeing his situation as something that needed to be fixed or escaped. This was his life now, and it was a good life, perhaps better than any he might have lived in civilization. Sometimes he imagined what it would be like to return to human society. The thought was almost frightening. How would he bear the noise, the crowds, the constant demands and expectations? How would he tolerate the artificial distinctions between people, the hierarchies of rank and wealth and status that seemed so important in civilization, but so meaningless here? How would he adapt to living indoors, following schedules, doing work that had no intrinsic meaning? The island had spoiled him for ordinary life. He had tasted freedom, silence, and authentic existence. Everything else would seem like a pale shadow, but he tried not to dwell on such thoughts. They belonged to a hypothetical future that might never come. Better to focus on what was actually present: the feel of sand beneath his feet, the sound of waves, the dance of light on water, the simple miracle of being alive and aware in a beautiful world. This moment was enough. This moment was everything. One afternoon, as he sat on his favorite promontory, watching clouds build over the ocean, he experienced something that defied easy description. It began as a sense of expanding awareness, as if his consciousness was growing larger, extending beyond the boundaries of his physical body. He felt himself becoming the rock he sat on, the air that moved around him, the water that stretched to the horizon. The boundaries that normally separated self from world dissolved completely, and for a timeless moment, there was only awareness itself, pure, unbounded, infinite. He couldn't have said how long this state lasted. Time had no meaning in that expanded consciousness. But when he returned to his ordinary awareness, when he became Alexander Selkirk again sitting on a rock on an island, everything seemed different. The world was more vivid, more alive, more precious than ever. Colors were more intense, sounds more rich and layered. The very air seemed to shimmer with energy. He had touched something beyond the ordinary realm of experience, something that mystics wrote about, but that most people never encountered directly. The experience left him changed. From that point forward, he carried within him the memory of that boundless awareness, that unity with all existence. It informed everything he did, every choice he made, every moment he experienced. He knew now, with unshakable certainty, that he was not separate from the world, but an expression of it, a temporary form taken by the universe's creative energy. This knowledge brought profound peace and an end to the last lingering traces of existential anxiety. Days flowed into weeks, weeks into months. The fourth year passed its midpoint and continued toward completion. Selkirk had long since stopped thinking about years or counting time. He existed in an eternal present that somehow contained all of past and future within its stillness. He was 28 when he'd arrived on the island, which made him 32 now, though he neither looked nor felt that age. His body was ageless, maintained by constant movement and simple diet. His mind was clearer than it had ever been, unclouded by the mental fog that comes from poor nutrition, insufficient sleep, and constant stress. He sometimes wondered if other humans had lived like this, in such intimate contact with nature, in such complete solitude. Surely throughout history, there had been hermits and solitaries who had sought this same transformation. Perhaps there were places in the world where people still lived this way. Indigenous peoples who had never lost their connection to the land, monks in remote monasteries, wanderers who had walked away from civilization and never looked back. The thought that he was part of a lineage, even if he would never meet his spiritual siblings, brought comfort. He had become, in a sense, fully human. Not human as defined by civilization, that narrow, constrained version of humanity focused on productivity and conformity, but human in the deeper sense, a conscious being fully present in the world, aware of beauty, capable of wonder, in harmony with the rhythms of life and death, growth and decay, light and darkness. This was what humans were meant to be, before cities and commerce and all the complexities of social life had distorted the simple truth of existence. One morning, as he performed his dawn ritual on the beach, he saw something that made his heart quicken. On the horizon, barely visible in the early light, were sails. A ship. After all this time, after he'd almost stopped hoping, a ship had finally come. He stood very still, watching as it grew larger, confirming that it was indeed heading toward the island. His mind raced through possibilities. It might be Spanish. This was their territory, after all. It might be privateers like his own former crew. It might be merchant vessels or naval ships. Whoever they were, they represented his opportunity to leave, to return to human society. But as he watched the ship approach, Selkirk felt something unexpected. Not joy or relief, but a profound ambivalence. Part of him wanted rescue, wanted to return to civilization, to see his family again, to tell his story, to resume his place in human society. But another part, perhaps the larger part, wanted to stay. This island had been his salvation, his teacher, his home. Leaving felt like a betrayal, like turning his back on everything he'd learned and become. The ship was English, as it turned out. The Duke, a privateer under Captain Woodes Rogers, exploring the Pacific in search of Spanish prizes. They sent a boat ashore, and Selkirk, dressed in his crude goatskin garments, looking more like a wild man than a civilized sailor, walked down to meet them. The men stared at him in astonishment. They'd heard legends of a marooned sailor on this island, but had barely believed them. And here he was, alive, healthy, speaking English, though his voice was rough from disuse. Captain Rogers offered him passage, a return to civilization, a chance to resume his life. Selkirk agreed, though part of him wanted to refuse, to send the ship away and remain in his paradise. But he knew that refusing would seem like madness to these men. And perhaps, he thought, there was purpose in returning. Perhaps he was meant to carry the lessons of this island back to the world, to share what he'd learned about simplicity, presence, and the nature of true contentment. He gathered his few possessions, his Bible, his navigational tools, some of his drawings. He walked through his island one last time, saying goodbye to places that had become sacred to him. The beach where he'd greeted thousands of sunrises. The cave that had been his shelter and home. The promontory where he'd watched for ships and discovered infinite patience. The valleys and peaks and hidden pools that he knew better than he'd ever known any place in his life. The goats watched him with their intelligent amber eyes. The seals barely stirred as he passed their colonies one final time. The birds sang their usual songs, unchanged by his departure. The island would continue without him, exactly as it had existed for millions of years before he arrived, and would exist for millions of years after he left. He was a brief visitor, and the island would barely notice his absence. As the ship's boat carried him away from the shore, Selkirk looked back at his island. Maza Tierra, the closer land, though it had been anything but close for 4 years and 4 months. The green peaks rising from blue water, the white beaches and dark cliffs, the forests and meadows he'd explored so thoroughly. It grew smaller as the boat pulled away, eventually becoming just another shape on the horizon. And then it was gone, swallowed by distance and haze. He turned to face forward, toward the ship that would carry him back to civilization. Sailors crowded the rail, eager to hear his story. Captain Rogers waited with questions about the island, about survival, about the Spanish ships that sometimes visited these waters. Selkirk would answer their questions, would resume his role as a civilized man, would eventually return to Scotland and find that the world had barely noticed his absence. But he carried the island within him now. Its silence, its beauty, its lessons would be with him forever. He had learned what it meant to be truly present, truly alive. He had learned that happiness was not something to be pursued, but something that emerged naturally when you stopped resisting reality. He had learned that human beings could live with almost nothing and still be content, that solitude could be transformative rather than destructive, that nature was not something to be conquered, but something to be honored and joined. These lessons would sustain him through whatever came next, and sometimes, in quiet moments for the rest of his life, he would close his eyes and return in memory to that island in the Pacific, feeling again the sand beneath his feet, hearing again the eternal song of the waves, seeing again the stars that had kept him company through 1,000 tranquil nights. He had been alone, but never lonely. He had been cast away, but had found a home. He had lost everything and gained what mattered most. The island had given him the greatest gift possible, the understanding that he already possessed everything he needed to be complete, whole, and profoundly at peace. And that gift would stay with him, a treasure more valuable than any material wealth, for all his remaining days. And so, dear listener, our journey comes to its gentle close. Tonight, you've drifted across distant waters to an island where time moved slowly and peace came naturally. You've walked with Alexander Selkirk through his transformation from castaway to sage, discovering that true contentment blooms not from what we possess, but from our ability to be fully present in each precious moment. Thank you for spending this tranquil time with Nights of Tranquility and Stories. If this journey brought you peace, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more soothing escapes into worlds of beauty and serenity. Let us continue exploring together, from forgotten islands to starlit deserts, from whispering forests to the silence of mountain peaks. May you carry the island's peace with you into your dreams, and may you wake refreshed and renewed. Until next time, from Nights of Tranquility and Stories, sweet dreams and peaceful journeys.